Welcome to a Pulp event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, since 1996, online at thepulp.net. This Pulp event podcast features a panel discussion of the thrilling heroes of standard magazines, pulps, and comics. The panel consists of Will Murray, pulp historian, and author of The New Adventures of Doc Savage and Tarzan, Michelle Nolan, longtime journalist, pop culture columnist, and 2014 Inkpot Award winner, and popular culture professor Garyn Roberts, who was awarded the Munsey in 2013. PulpFest's Mike Chom co-introduces the panel.
Will everyone knows is Doc and Tarzan writer and long-standing authority on popular culture and pulp fiction. Michelle's written a bunch about comics, a long-time columnist for the Comic Buyer's Guide, and she's also written some books on pulps and sports fiction. Garyn is a professor of English and popular culture, has many collections of pulp fiction that he's introduced and edited, and he also put together one of the leading textbooks on science fiction used in college, Prentice Hall.
Great. Anthology of Science Fiction.
Anthology of Science Fiction. So here they go.
I'm going to briefly start this with a short background on thrilling. No publisher in American history, to the best of my knowledge, has run, regardless of the quality of this, I won't say that it's the best fiction, but has run more versatile fiction. I mean, Street and Smith obviously printed the most fiction, but when it comes to comic book, well, pulps first, then comic books, then paperbacks, which are all very distinct marketing decisions, all very unusually different marketing decisions. There was a brief about, in Thrilling's case, 15-year overlap between their three genres of, if you will, of the publication. In 1931, Ned Pines decided to expand from, was it College Humor, Will?
Yeah.
College Humor, and a couple of other magazines to the pulp, the burgeoning pulp market. And he ran the company from 1931 to the Pulpwise till 58 with the last of the Texas Rangers and Jim Hatfield, and Ranch Romances, which was their best-selling pulp for a long time. Lasted till 1971, largely with reprints. Comic books were probably, in terms of excellence, in some ways the comic books are by far the most memorable aspects of pop culture, because Alex Schoenberg, probably the most frenetic and talented artist, comic book wise, not fine art, but comic book wise, did most of the covers for what they called Needor or Better or Standard Comics from in the 40s. And he even worked into the 50s on other genres. The heroes all disappeared in 49, 48, 49. The Popular Library actually printed, I think it was all reprints, just about. I mean, there weren't too many originals.
Yeah, an original, yeah.
But Popular Library didn't have the quality of a Bantam or a Ballantine, but Popular Library printed an immense number of paperbacks, and they were probably the best example of sexed up literature in American history. They would take legitimate literature, such as the sports novel The Hero by Millard Lampell, and they made it, this novel didn't have an iota of sex in it to speak of. I mean, it probably had some veiled references, but it wasn't a sex story. The cover looks like the hero is being propositioned by somebody. And there was a, well, I'm getting in the weeds here, but there was a order that went out in the mid 40s, late 40s on the paperbacks before they tamed it down. we want boobs and legs. And it was in some ways more garish than Fiction House, because Fiction House never printed literature. They printed escape fiction only, but Popular Library printed literature. And the covers are unbelievably different from what's inside. Will, what do you think is of the three genres? And Popular Library went for way after the comic. Comics disappeared in '59, or in Dennis Semanis's case, transferred to different ownership. The pulps disappeared, like I said, in '58, except Ranch Romances. Paperbacks continued, into the '80s under the Popular Library?
Yeah, at least, the '70s anyway.
Well, but paperbacks continued a long time, and I was already out of college when they were still going very strong. Okay, Will, what do you think of the three? I'm trying to approach it from a broad standpoint. I think the comic books were in many ways their best publications. Relative to the market they served.
No, I don't agree with that at all.
Okay, what do you have? Okay, you have at
I
it.
mean, the comic books didn't have as strong, had a good editor, but they were doing fairly relatively generic comics at that time.
That's true.
You know, that you didn't have the depth of story that Weisinger and Schiff brought to DC. You didn't have the versatility and creativity that Joe Simon and Stan Lee brought to Timely Comics.
That's true. I agree.
So in that sense, I think they were interesting comics in that they were very much inspired by their pulp line, but they didn't seem to invest a lot into them. And I think they probably saw comics, as many did, as a fad. So they didn't try to build the line. They just tried to exploit the commercial opportunities.
But remember one thing, Will, in the '40s during World War II, the comic books never got cut back. The pulps got disastrously cut back. So I think that says a lot.
Well, it says where the money was going.
Well, I was speaking of money, not quality.
Yeah.
Perhaps the paper length that was used for comics didn't require nearly as much paper as a pulp magazine either.
No, it didn't.
Yeah. You were right about Popular Library, all the wonderful Captain Future reprints and all that. They were lousy paperbacks. They fell apart.
They
You
fell
buy
apart.
them today, the binding, the glue went to hell on them.
And they used repurposed covers from Perry Rodin in Germany at that point, and they were often using repurposed pulp covers in the 50s, in the 40s. So they were doing them as cheaply as possible.
Well, they were pulp literature reprinted for the market that no longer had pulps, but they still had guys that liked to read westerns and gals that like to read ranch romances and other Dino and type, Western romance type stories. And there was, I don't think they cared about them. They were meant for one owner, one reading. If you go into a used bookstore that has a lot of paperbacks, the ones in the worst condition are almost invariably Popular Library. I can vouch for that. Garyn, what do you have to say about thrilling in general?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I'm happy to listen to you two, because I really, we just saw in the last panel
I wish one of my teachers would hear you say that back in the day.
a wealth of information, and I'm just thinking about the last panel and different perspectives and some very insightful, kind of unique ideas. And I'm going to be in line tomorrow to buy John's book as the door opens. But and Nathan at the end, not to change the topic, I love that guy because he comes from my school of thinking about cultural history and this kind of stuff. And thinking about
he's very talented.
And I love his book. His book should have won some kind of award from some national press. I really think it's that good.
Great book.
But anyway, in regard to thrilling, it's fun material. I liked what maybe you wrote and somebody else I saw on the website wrote about how it may not have been the best of all pulp fiction that ever came out, but it had its moments and it lasted a long time. And you think about some of the authors they had in their stable, you think of people who I'm interested in, but I'm not an expert on. Edmund Hamilton, Lee Brackett, recently been doing lots of research. Henry Kuttner.
Tons of Kuttner.
We just completed the second volume with Steve Hafner of which goes back to that panel we just came from. We just, the Watcher at the Door comes out hopefully for World Fantasy in October, and it's a beautiful volume again. Second volume, the first one's out of print, The Terror in the House. And what we find out is just what they said on the first panel. Everybody thinks that Lovecraft influenced everybody, and I love Lovecraft, don't get me wrong, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But it's amazing how much Poe had as much or more influence on Henry Kuttner.
Very much so.
The Kuttner stories are, even though he loved and he corresponded with Lovecraft, they were talking about March of 37, just in the last couple months of his life, Robert Bloch introduced him via correspondence to Lovecraft. And he hung on to Lovecraft, and he was crushed a couple months later when Lovecraft died. And so he did a series, I'm off the topic, but the influence and complexities of all these things. So you got Kuttner, and you've also got a young aspiring writer who, by his own description, was a pain in the ass to the other writers because he was such a pest, and that was Ray Bradbury.
And Louis L'Amour, too.
That's right, yeah. So you guys talk.
Louis
I like what
L'Amour
you're saying.
started his career almost entirely with Standard, and they almost never cover featured him for over 10 years. There was a sports pulp where there were 7 stories in the pulp, and his was the only one that didn't get his name on the cover.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a bad story. I mean, it was okay. He did know football. I was going to make one other point out that I'm going to ask Will to expand upon. Standard did something in pulps that other publishers didn't want to do. And that's they depended on a stable of authors who were very loyal to Leo Margulies, the executive editor. And if you take out the sports pulps and the romance pulps, you're left with, Standard did about 3,776 pulps, give or take. But I've spent untold amounts of time getting all these down in an index, okay? Standard did take away the romance and sports, which rarely had continuing characters from any publisher, okay? Take those away. Standard in the other genres did well over 1,000 hero characters in the Western and well, shall we say, costume hero for a better phrase, genres. 1,000 plus stories, mostly very long stories, about heroes. And granted, they weren't as, shall we say, as well done as Dime Detective or some of the other pulp companies, but the heroes in Standard were it was an unbelievably prolific thing to have that many heroes, and they were roughly evenly divided between the Westerns and the other heroes. I call them superheroes just because they're mostly unrealistic people. But the Western characters actually were much more realistic in the Standard pulps than the heroes. And I'm one who's been utterly fascinated from both a social and political aspect of what I call the Robin Hood mythos, which is essentially, does one human being, no matter how talented they are, have the right to be judge, jury, and executioner? It's a fascinating thing because you're talking about who the villain is and all this. It's way too long to discuss, but it's partly involved with Standard. Anyway, it's 1 out of 3 Standard pulps, taking away sports and romance. 1 out of 3 Standard pulps had a regular hero, almost always cover featured, and the authors, it's an amazing record. Will, what do you have to say about that?
No, you just said it.
Oh, well, I mean, can you add anything to it?
Well, yeah, I could add a lot to it.
Okay, please do.
But, I wouldn't know where to start. The shadow at Street and Smith may have saved the pulp magazine industry for a decade of the 1930s and into the 40s by momentum because pulps were dying with the Depression. People just didn't have the 20 or 25 or 15 or 10
Even
cents.
a dime.
And so, the success of Thrilling was partly because it was a dime price. And the Shadow was an update of the old dime novel characters that would come out every month in dime novel form. And when it was a hit, Margulies and Ned Pines, they were the first to copy it. Walter Gibson told the story that when the Shadow started to go big, he went to Street and Smith and his editor too and said, we ought to do something called the Phantom because if we don't, someone will. And they dithered, Street and Smith dithered, and Margulies and Pines came out with the Phantom Detective, and that was that. The name was taken. And that was the first rival. That predated Doc Savage by a hair, but it predated Doc Savage. And once a second publisher enters into something, you know they're hearing what the circulation is from somebody, distributors. And, you know, the Phantom ran longer than the Shadow and Doc, just didn't rack up as many novels because it was bi-monthly for a long period of time. But very successful magazine. With a core of writers and then later a revolving door of writers, but they always had certain writers who would be there as a spine for years and years, and they would change spines, and they would have, you know, Henry Cutler did a couple of Phantom Detectives.
Who didn't?
Henry, yeah,
Who didn't?
you know, we're not sure who didn't, but, you know, we're not sure who did in a lot of cases. We just have a lot of known suspects. And, you know, they started the Lone Eagle, not long after, I think the Long Eagle may have predated G8, I've forgotten now.
It's close.
It's close.
By 1 month.
By 1 month. Yeah, okay. So, you know, they jumped into that field. The Lone Eagle, you know, did pretty well. He lasted long enough as a World War I hero that he was transitioned to a World War II hero.
75 total issues.
When you know, World War II broke out, they immediately said, we're going to the modern day. They didn't do that with G8. They should have, but they didn't. And they had a lot of obscure characters who lasted short periods of time. The one that I think is most, well, you know, this was very pioneering. G-Men, starring Dan Fowler. That was probably their best written series in terms of the quality of the writing, because they brought in a military guy, Major George Fielding Elliott.
George Fielding, yeah.
And he wrote the early Dan Fowlers. What's interesting is they announced that magazine as Secret Service detective stories, and then they delayed it. And I don't know what was going on there, but I think what happened is the G-Men and J. Edgar Hoover became very big.
The movie G-Men with
G-Men.
Jimmy Cagney was why, I don't know for sure, but I think that's why they changed
I've
it.
forgotten that. And so suddenly they said G-Men, that's better than Secret Service detective stories. And they were very mature stories compared to the Phantom and the other stuff.
I'm going to add something to that. Dan Fowler is probably the most underrated hero in all of pulpdom.
Absolutely.
And the reason I say that is here was a man, now granted the stories had the somewhat stereotypical American patriotism, and they made J. Edgar Hoover, you know, there were no talk of dresses and stuff like that. They made J. Edgar Hoover sound like God. But be that as it may, Dan Fowler was an amazingly creative, the stories are creative. He gets into the damnedest traps. And you really think this is it for Dan Fowler. I mean, they're very creative traps, and the stories hold your interest. They don't quit. And you can sit, I tried to go to sleep reading Dan Fowler, and when, unfortunately, for my work years ago when I was a newspaper editor, if you start a Dan Fowler story, it's going to be hard to finish. I mean it. And I don't know, Will, you like them as much as I do, but they're darn good stories.
They are.
And but he's a great character. And his partner, Larry, what's his name? Larry, I can't remember his, Kendall. Larry Kendall. Great sidekick. Wonderful sidekick.
There was a famous Dan Fowler story back in the day that I know from a guy who read Pulps. It was called Bloody Bullets. And you wouldn't tell it from the blurb of the thing, but it's about an attempt to assassinate President Roosevelt. And when that was published, that was considered a very daring story for a pulp magazine, because, you know, it was you just didn't do that in popular.
Might be the best Dan Fowler. It's great.
It might be one of the best Dan Fowlers, because it was like, you know, that movie Suddenly with Frank Sinatra.
Oh, yeah,
you know,
54.
Was it more like 58 or something? Was it 54?
Maybe, I don't know.
But it was a few years before the Kennedy assassination. It was about an attempt to assassinate the
Same
president.
ballpark.
Yeah, same ballpark. The interesting one, Captain Future, is very interesting. Very popular with science fiction fans. The character was in development allegedly when the first World Fantasy Convention took place in New York in '39. I think it was March, but don't quote me on the month. And Leo Margulies and Mort Weisinger attended that, and Mark Leeser was reported to say, I didn't know your fans would be so damn sincere, and he claimed on the spot, we're gonna give you a magazine, exactly what you want. Supposedly the thing was already in development, but that came out of that, that emergence of science fiction fandom, because, Mort Weisinger was a big science fiction fan, he came out of science fiction fandom, and although this was a quarterly, it lasted it didn't rack up a lot of issues, but it lasted through the war, and even past the war it was revived, and it's very, very well remembered as a science fiction Doc Savage, which is what it was meant to be.
And it also had the distinction when they discontinued it because of the wartime paper shortage in late 43, early 44, I forget exactly, but anyway, they ran 17 issues all quarterly. When they quarterly tells you something about science fiction that was very much a niche pulp field. When they discontinued it, they actually had so much demand from readers for more Captain Future stories that they ran 10 more stories in Startling Stories over a 5-year period. And there were people writing to astounding science fiction, which of course was a hoi polloi, stuffy, big-time science fiction thing. They were talking about Captain Future as though he was written for kindergartners, and it wasn't. It was good science fiction. What do you think?
It was good space opera, but it was...
Well, but I like space operas. So
but it was juvenile. There's no question.
But it was much better than, say, Flash Gordon serials, or, that kind of thing. Higher level. And a team. It was a team.
Mm-hmm.
Captain Future was not just, it was a team. I think what made people think this thing was real juvenile was the name of the character. Captain Future, which is a comic book title.
But it was juvenile the way Doc Savage was juvenile.
Mm-hmm.
You had the bickering aides, and you had... Didn't they do a lot of sports on other planets,
Oh, yeah.
playing, which was, obviously, a shtick, and, you don't really do shtick in serious stories. But, I love the Captain Futures, but the older you get, the harder they are to read.
That's right. So Hamilton also was kind of interesting in that, for that and other publishers, he was also writing comic book scripts.
Oh, yeah.
And by the way, we all know from the one that Will just pulled up, that's the poster in Leonard and Sheldon's apartment in The Big Bang Theory, right? The first Captain Future.
By the way, before I forget, if you want to read some of the early, or the comic book heroes from Standard, Tony Tolan's new Black Bat reprint magazine, and his Phantom Detective, and for all I know, some others later. They published comic book stories at the end of these pulp reprints, which is kind of a daring thing to do. I wasn't sure that commercially it was something that would work, but Tony proved me wrong, and they've been very successful. I wrote the introduction to the Phantom Detective at #1, and I made the admission that I didn't even know there was a Phantom Detective in Standard Comics when I did the the world's first hero by hero or book by book index of comic book heroes in 1968 when I was 20 years old. And my parents thought I was crazy until they started seeing envelopes with money coming into the mail every day. And I was making good money on these things. But anyway, I was trying to say that the comic books, Tony's giving a great overview of the comic book. This Black Bat Pulp, which is coming out, will have a story of the Mask. And Tony, is that the Black Bat?
It's an adaptation of the first Black Bat novel, Brandon the Black Bat.
Okay, anyway, it's not Batman, it's the Mask, but it's an exciting comics #1, and Black Terror didn't show up till #9. And it was back when, I think, Major Mars or something was their lead feature. But they definitely did a good job with this.
Major Mars was Captain Future adaptation.
Oh, I know, but the name Major Mars is just too upsetting for words. Anyway, it's the kind of thing that made my 6th grade teacher tell me your brain is rotting every day you read these things. She may have been correct. But the thing is that Captain Future and the other characters, you're going to see this stuff adopted, and Tony's going to get more and more of these public domain stories and publish them. And I think I needed to say that because they're interesting. And the comic books are really expensive. The Alex Schoenberg covers make these comic books always $50, $100, $200. And they're dirt. I mean, they're not dirt cheap. They're very expensive. And that's a big problem if you want to read them. When I bought them all, I got to tell you this anecdote. There was a store in Sacramento, a used bookstore called the Liberty Bookstore. And they had incredible amounts of Golden Age comics, but they were one of the few stores that had any what they call need-or comics in the early 60s. And most fans didn't even know these characters existed. They discovered, these four guys that published fanzines in the Bay Area, discovered this store and bought all their Golden Age comics at 40 cents a comic and sold them for $1, a lot to me when I found out about it. I drove to Oakland and, pretty well wiped these guys out. But the need-or comics like Black Terror and Fighting Ink are really fun. Like Will said, they're generic, but they're fun to read. But they're so expensive. I bought them for $1 a piece for years. And then all of a sudden, I forget who it was that publicized Schoenberg. I forget the person. Maybe somebody had the wise idea to publicize Schoenberg in the 80s, and they went from being $1 to being $20 almost overnight. It was worse than the gas scams they're running on automobile drivers. But it's amazing what these comic books have in their. If you've never seen the covers, these things are like Karl Barks, with superheroes fighting the Germans and Japanese. And some of them are just utterly astounding with their vivid imageries. Silly to a point and racist for sure, but they were very amazing.
I wanted to talk about the Black Bat since you brought it up. Where Tony and I are Tony's putting out the Black Bat, but I'm supporting him with the background articles. And I interviewed Norman Daniels, who created the Black Bat.
They're worth the price. They are.
Many years ago. We've done the first 2 Black Bats in the first volume, which is about to come out. In the second volume, we'll have the second 2. After that, we may or may not skip around because there's some interesting writers like Norval Page and Lawrence Donovan who did Black Bats. But the Black Bat has an interesting synchronicity. In November of '38, Norman Daniels was asked to create a character to emulate the Shadow. And he came up with a character called the Tiger. He was called the Tiger because his face was scarred with acid and the scars looked like tiger stripes. And Leo Margulies, when he got the manuscript, said, you know what, we want to change this character's name because he's going to Black Bat Detective magazine. We're going to call him the Black Bat. So that was November, December. The very end of December or the beginning of January of 38, 39, Bob Kane was asked to do something to emulate Superman. And his first concept was a character called Birdman, a man with hawk wings and a red outfit. And he brought in his collaborator, Bill Finger, a big Shadow fan, they both were, and to sort of like brainstorm the thing, and they turned it into Batman. Okay? So, simultaneously, completely unknown to each other, these 2 publishers were producing a Bat hero, unbeknownst to one another.
They had no idea.
They had no idea. So in the end of March, Detective Comics 27 comes out with the first Batman story. At the end of April, the first Black Bat in Black Book Detective comes out, and then the lawyers got very active. It happened.
The timing was impossible to.
It's amazing timing. And what's interesting is neither character started out as a bad character. He started out differently and evolved into a bad character. So there's some zeitgeist there. So curiously, there's a writer named Whitney Ellsworth, who had been an early DC editor, went to Hollywood, came back, wrote G-Man novels and fan of detectives for Leo Margulies, and then was drifting back towards DC as DC was expanding with Superman and Batman. And I don't know that he was at DC in official capacity, but Whitney Ellsworth basically brokered an understanding that avoided a lawsuit.
He wasn't official yet. Vince Sullivan did his job, but within a few years, he was the man.
So the deal they struck was that Batman would stay out of the pulps and the Black Bat would stay out of comic books. And that worked out. But when Nidor started doing comic books, they wanted to adapt the Black Bat. So they had a first story done, and I guess they called him the Owl, which is
There
the
already
closest to
was
that.
an owl.
But then they found out there was already an owl and a black owl. So
And the owl in Dell Comics too.
yeah, so they had to change it to the mask. He still wore a kind of cowl, an owl kind of cowl in the first story. I think they changed it in the second and third. But you know, talk about generic comics. You couldn't get any more generic than the mask. So it's the same story as the first Black Bat story, but he was called the Mask. They changed the characters, other characters' names somewhat, slightly. Tony Quinn became Colby Quinn. I don't know what that.
Tony Colby.
Tony Colby.
Tony
Okay.
Colby, yeah.
Okay. I think Colby Quinn was a byline in the Spicy Pulps, and I don't know who that was. But anyway, so, you know, and Major Mars was Captain Future. Then they decided to use the name on a completely different character, and they didn't continue Major Mars. It was a very odd comic book house in that stuff would start and get ash canned or transformed or renamed and whatever. And it's fascinating from the standpoint of looking at what they had to do these comics and how they had adapted, but it's also kind of catch as catch can. You know, not enough work went into the art of story.
When you're a 1960s historian, which I guess we all were, you can't believe how difficult it was to have these changes and to see like Captain Future in Startling Comics #1 was a dead knockoff of Superman. You know, he was more of a knockoff of Superman than Captain Marvel ever was. I mean, he was Superman. You know, although at that time there was no lawsuit that prevailed. I mean, if he'd come earlier, I think there would have been a lawsuit. But Captain Future was, you know, on the cover until Fighting Yank came along in #10. A much better character, much more original character. I mean, the ghost of your ancestors making you superpowered to fight World War II was just a great. That was probably the most creative stories they had. And the but Captain, to go through these comic books issue by issue and realize for an index and realize how really different they were than the DCs or the other quality, you know, the stable, what I call the stable productive companies, you know. Marvel was not stable. Marvel would produce, you know, 9 superheroes that lasted 3 issues apiece. I mean, everybody thinks about Captain Marvel, but the majority of Marvel's characters are dismal failures for years. But anyway, so Standard had this very unique approach, and I think, as Will pointed out, it was something nobody else did, because nobody else had the pulps, had as many pulps heroes to adopt to comic books, and this included Westerns. Right. Let's talk a little about the Westerns, Will.
Do we have
Yeah.
to?
I mean, we should at least cover them slightly.
As long
Masked
as-
Rider. How about Masked Rider?
As long as you save some time for the Green Ghost, I want to hear what you think.
Oh, the Green Ghost. Oh my God.
And for the Ghost, and then.
I'll leave that for Will.
Yeah.
You know, haven't read one of those in years. Let's talk about the Green Ghost then. Let's go.
All right. Well, you know, there were 2 green ghosts, just as there was a bat before there was the black bat. You know, Leo and his team, they might run a short-lived character, it would die the death or just run its course, but they would revive the concept with different character, different writer. Johnston McCulley did a character called the Green Ghost in Thrilling Detective. We think he did a character called the Bat, who was very similar to Batman in his origin. A bat came through his window and he said, "I'll be the Bat." But he wrote that, whoever wrote it wrote under the name C.K.M. Scanlon. We just don't know who it was, but it's the same Johnston McCulley stylistics, the hero, the hood over the head, the gas mask, gas gun type of thing. Well, anyway, the Green Ghost by Johnston McCulley ran its course by 35 or 6. And then in 1940, G.T. Fleming Roberts, an up-and-coming writer, was picked and tabbed to do the Ghost for Thrilling. George Chance, a professional musician who fights crime. I guess it didn't sell that well. It came out at the same time as Captain Future. It was a quarterly. But after a few issues, they changed it to the Green Ghost. They jazzed him up a little bit, gave him a little green light to illuminate his disguised face, so he became the Green Ghost. And it ran for a few issues, and then it ran in Thrilling
Mystery. Yeah.
Thrilling Mystery for a while, and I believe it was in the comics. as well.
Yeah,
Most of
it
them
was in
were,
the comics.
you know. And, you know, it was pretty interesting. You know, if they had a successful name or concept and it ran its course, it would tend to be revived later, but it completely changed in the revision, which is interesting. It meant that they had a corporate memory, corporate history of, remember that thing that we did 4 years ago that, you know, people liked and then it kind of died? Let's use some of that again. Let's try that
A
again.
little like DC in the 50s when they revived old characters.
Yeah.
Institutional memory was important in these kind of things.
Yeah, institutional memory is what I was looking for.
So what I was going to, Garyn, did you want to say anything about the
No,
preview?
you're doing great.
The other thing about Thrilling is that their heroes lasted way longer than by rights they should have lasted. However, they started sexing those stories up too, and the Phantom detective books started featuring Muriel Havens, the reporter, the sex bomb reporter that was sort of a sexed up Lois Lane, on the covers, right, for a few issues.
For a few issues.
And the Phantom was nowhere to be seen. Well, the last Black Bat story is about as Norrish as any pulp story that ever appeared. Dealt with a prostitution ring, if you can imagine. And I can't remember the name of the story, but it was printed.
Hot, Willing, and Deadly.
That's it. Hot, Willing, and Deadly. Was it Stuart Sterling that wrote it?
Yeah,
Stuart Sterling, the famous mystery writer, a very good writer, wrote this story. It's a good story. But Tony Quinn, the Black Bat, the only mention of the Black Bat is Tony Quinn's memory of his former identity. Now, there was and to the best of my knowledge, Will correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there was ever, I wrote a whole 5,000 word essay on this in Comic Book Marketplace, and the editor was tearing his hair out trying to get it in the magazine. But it was, I think, the only pulp hero story where the secret identity of the character, the civilian identity, was, and his, in this case, girlfriend, etc., whatever you want to call her. This story was the only time have ever seen where there was no appearance by the superhero, by the Black Bat. It was just a memory of the Black Bat, and it was a detective story. And actually, it was a spicy detective story that didn't run in Spicy Detective. But this story was unbelievably violent and I mean, it was so unlike the Black Bat series that it's almost not part of the canon. It's just a totally unique. You really shouldn't modify unique, but it's a unique situation in the pulps. Am I right, Will?
You're half right. There was
Okay.
there was some Bruce Elliott shadows where the shadow never appeared. But as far as
Never read those.
as far as the sex is concerned, you know, for a hero pulp, that's pretty bizarre. But
And that issue is very rare. It cost me an arm and a leg, that one.
So who wrote that story?
Stuart
Stuart
Sterling,
Sterling.
real
Oh,
name
that's-
Prentice
you
Famous,
Prentice.
he wrote a
That's
whole
right.
slew of character detectives like Pedley and Vine and all the hotel detective, the
Yeah.
fireman detective, all these. Stuart Sterling had a really unusual approach. But anyway, that's what happened at the end of these last few pulps. But it's kind of amazing to me that the comic book heroes all, and I mean all, disappeared in 1948 and 49. Not one of them remained, and we're talking, a couple dozen heroes. They were gone, but the pulp heroes hung around, and it was just different.
Well, I think there was momentum, and again, you have to look at the commercial side. You know, Leo and Ned Pines, they had the distribution. If you had the distribution, because there's a rumor that one of the reasons Street and Smith folded their pulps is their distributor said, you know what, we don't want to do these anymore. It doesn't matter that they're profitable.
They didn't want the lost leaders.
Yeah. So, American News was very powerful until like 55 when it went out of business. So they needed the product. The product was reliable, and the public liked it. And, Margulies was, I keep saying, I shouldn't say Margulies because it was Ned Pines at that point, but, the last, thrilling pulp was 58. That's pretty late in the day. A decade after most everybody else was folding their tent. The only thing that lasted longer was the bottom of the barrel Columbia line that lasted till 60 a couple of years ago, but those were, demi-pulps at that point, and they were pretty low rent things. So they were surviving probably on cheapness, where the thrilling pulps were surviving as, frontline pulps.
There were way more, that what I wanted to say about Thrilling's heroes, both Western and superheroes, there were way more of those than any other publisher except Street and Smith, which had these long-running Doc Savage and The Shadow. But and combined, those two had over 500 stories. But it was, and Tony's reprinting every last one of them. A monumental effort, I must say. But the heroes in the other pulps, there were never very many heroes. In Street and Smith and Standard had almost all of them, with a few exceptions. Popular had the Spider and a few detectives and whatnot, but Fiction House had Kygor, the jungle hero, and a few Sheena stories, but it wasn't the same thing. And the other pulps tended to be much more non-character oriented. And Standard and Street and Smith had a ton of characters you never heard of, right? I mean, a lot.
Yeah.
And Popular, not so much. Although, I probably shouldn't say that, because Dime Detective did have its regulars, but they weren't flashy the way the Standard, and in the Westerns, oh my God, I read a Flash Steel story, and you might think the Standard Westerns are bad, but this thing had zero characterization. I mean, I've never read a more cardboard. I mean, it was like this person was like that. There was no characterization whatsoever. I mean, just awful. I read it only as a means of torturing myself. And it was so bad. Great name, Flash Steel, but probably inspired by Flash Gordon, which was extremely successful the year or two before in comic strips and serials. But all I'm saying is that Thrilling was really deserves credit for over a dozen major heroes that lasted a long time. Think about this. Jim Hatfield in Texas Ranger, the lone wolf detective, range detective. This guy lasted 206 stories in Texas Rangers. 206 Western stories. That's amazing. That's the record.
And then the paperbacks after that.
Oh, well, that 93 paperbacks reprinted, at least, to the best of my knowledge, maybe more. But there was also 75 issues of Range Riders, and Mass Rider had 88 standard issues after taking over from Ranger Publications. And there was a lot. Rio Kid had 75 issues. There were just a lot of heroes. And then the superheroes, like Phantom Detective, lasted 170, and Dan Fowler's 112. I mean, this just didn't happen with the other companies. Oh, how many?
Run through the comments quick.
Okay. Oh, here's one. Commando Cubs. This is the classic. Back up to Commando Cubs. Go to you for Thrilling. Okay, this is the classic capturing Hitler in his bed. Look at the bedspread. That's an Alex Schoenberg. That's a typical Alex Schoenberg cover, except that the Commando Cubs only appeared on a couple of covers. It was usually Doc Strange. But I submitted these things, and okay, keep going.
That one sure looked derivative of Captain America. Earlier.
Here's the fighting Yank, who, like I said, was a hero by the grace of his ghostly ancestors. That when America needed a hero, they called for the fighting Yank. He also rode bombs into Tokyo, and the racist elements of Alex Schoenberg. There's no more racist cover than this one, and yet it was World War II, and this is a more typical American. This was like World's Finest Comics. It was their version of World's Finest, and sometimes the heroes on the cover and the heroes inside were not the same, which is unusual in the field, to say the least. But anyway, here's one of my favorites. This is the post. This came out late in 1945. After, I think we hit the stands about VJ Day, but 3 months after VE Day. This is. The soldiers got a Nazi souvenir there, And his wife and kid are waiting by the dock there and Doc Strange has a thing saying your job, your GI Bill, etc. That's probably my favorite Americana cover of any comic book at any time. That just epitomizes late 1945. And my dad was mustered out, a top-ranking officer in the Navy and a Pearl Harbor survivor. He was mustered out at the time that comic book appeared, so it means a lot to me. There's where World's Finest comes in. They would be like playing football, just like Superman and Batman and Robin, you know. And this is I'm personally involved in this. That was my first Nidor comic. Guy going into the Air Force had a box of old comics. I bumped into him at the secondhand bookstore on my weekly trip down there to dig into old comics, where I met Bud Plant when he was 13 years old. And this is the result of after World War II. This is 1946. They had the darndest time creating ideas for covers because they didn't have the villains. And they didn't want to just have routine crooks. So here's a kind of a humorous type thing. Oh, this Miss Mask, she ran only a handful of stories and 3 or 4 titles, but she was sort of there was a boom in, mostly Marvel fueled this, but there was a boom in feminine heroes in the late 40s, and she was part of it. And this is something that never happened in a Nidor story. Doc Strange rescued Princess Pantha on the cover. And that was kind of the passing of the comic book torch when Princess Pantha started appearing. Oh, here's another funny where Black Terror can't quite figure out why Miss Mask is giving the cop a what for a ticket. I like that cover. Oh, and there's Judy of the Jungle on a creature that never existed. I like this cover because unlike Sheena, this actually shows some creativity and not just the usual fighting black people. Okay, any more? Okay, that's a good question. Anyway, the bird's interesting. Does anybody have any questions? If we have time for any, Tony?
I think it might be interesting for you to mention something about the Sangor Comic Shop, which was run by Ned Pine's father-in-law.
Yeah, Richard Hughes. Richard Hughes, whose real name was...
Leo Rosenbaum.
Thank you, Leo Rosenbaum. Richard Hughes was editor of the ACG comics, which were actually started in 1943. And he created the Black Terror, the Fighting Yank, and Pyro Man, and several other characters. I wrote a letter to him in 1966 talking about Magic Man and Nemesis and the 60s hero boom. And I said, what's wrong with a hero, plowing into action with a big wahoo? Let's go back to the old days when heroes were heroes and all that stuff. And he wrote me back a letter and said, I'm so glad you remember me. Everybody thinks of me as a horror comics writer. And then after the Comics Code came in, a creative like Herbie and other characters like that. But I love those characters, and it was so cool to get a letter from him. But he was the editor of ACG, and the Sangor shop supplied the art, right?
And they also supplied art to DC for real screen comics.
Oh yeah, Fox and the Crow, Jim Davis. Yeah.
The art was packaged by Ned Pine's father-in-law.
Okay, and that was an interesting thing. Yes.
My question is, now, since they already had the Pulp character, Captain Future, why do they use the same name for a different character for the comic book?
Will you take that? I don't know.
I have no clue.
I
It
know.
was part of the mystery of why they did what they did. Why did they call Captain Future Major Mars and drop the character, and why did they start a new Captain Future?
Yeah, DC didn't care about that character.
I can only speculate that maybe Edmund Hamilton was understood to be somehow proprietary about Captain Future and they couldn't use it, but that doesn't make sense. Other people wrote the Captain Future pulp stories. I don't know. There's some weird convolution about that. I just don't get it. It's part of the mystery of that line, why it's interesting from a scholarship point of view, is you see these things done, redone, changed, and you wonder, what were they thinking? What was the idea behind this?
I have a question for you. How many of you have seen an Alex Schoenberg cover? Wow. Okay, so he really is good, right?
But a lot of them were timely.
What?
A lot of them were done for timely.
Well, he did almost all of Timely's, Harvey's, which was fewer heroes, Harvey's, Nedor's, and Holyoke Continental. He had 4 contracts, and he did almost all the superhero covers for those 4 companies during the time but he was probably the most productive, I mean, until you got to Kurt Swan and some of the 50s and 60s artists. In the 40s, I can't think of anybody who produced more superhero covers. There were more covers by other people, more superhero. Yes?
What happened to the original artwork that was used in comic books?
Very little, I don't know if have you ever seen any standard original
I
art?
think I've seen some later ones, 40s, late 40s.
Late 40s, yeah, but not those early ones.
40s.
They were probably thrown out, and nobody cared in those days. I guarantee you that when they were $1 a piece in the mid-60s, when I was discovering these things, my father thought I was a blithering idiot to spend $1 on a 10-cent comic book. And inflation notwithstanding, he thought that was insane. And later on, when I told him how much the pile was worth, and $20,000 came in, he went, and then Bud Plant and I founded the first freestanding comic book store in 1968 in San Jose, California. And we took in thousands and thousands of dollars in people the town was growing and it was just ravished. Dad was a famous businessman in town, and he could not believe that we were that successful. And he came in and he said, I apologize to you for thinking that you folks were nuts. You were really right, and comic books are good.
Did Schomburg ever do any pulp titles with those?
Oh, yeah. Will, you answer that? Sorry.
No, you're great, you're great.
Just a minute, Will.
Well,
Who's staying for the movies tonight? All right, pretty good crowd. So this will be the last question.
Go ahead.
Well, Schomburg did do pulp covers, but I mostly know him
Science
for
fiction.
science fiction covers and interiors too, as I recall.
Yeah, startling, thrilling, wonder.
Later children's books, science fiction juvenile covers, but he's today remembered largely for comic books, even though in the day he was probably more famous for his science fiction, because that was the more quality material that was being done. But he made his mark.
Well, thank you very much, and for the sake of the dealers, go buy some pulp reprints and some of the original pulps from Standard. Give them a chance. I think some of you will find they're enjoyable. I'm not saying they're great, but they're enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, Garyn, and Michelle.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the Pulp Net. When your next adventure was just a dime away. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps.